The courtroom was packed. Doctors, lawyers, journalists, city officials. They had all come to watch the woman be destroyed. She had been charged with practicing medicine without a license, with fraud, with deliberately inducing trances in vulnerable people for financial gain. The newspapers had called her a hypnotist, a lunatic, a dangerous fraud who needed to be stopped before she hurt someone. The prosecution was confident. The evidence was stacked. The woman sitting at the defense table was small, plainly dressed, and utterly calm. One by one, the prosecution called its witnesses. And one by one, those witnesses testified to things that broke the prosecution's case open from the inside. A man who had been deaf for years, hearing perfectly. A woman who had been crippled, walking. A child who had been given up for dead, alive and healthy. The case was dismissed. The woman walked out of the courtroom and went straight back to her tent and kept preaching. This is the story of Maria Woodworth-Etter, the woman they tried to silence, the woman God refused to let be silenced. Maria Beulah Underwood was born on July 22, 1844, in Lisbon, Ohio. She was born into a farming family in rural Ohio at a time when America was still a largely agricultural nation, before the Civil War, before industrialization had fully transformed the country, before women had the vote, before women were allowed to preach in most churches. She was born into a world that had already decided what she was allowed to be, and God had already decided otherwise. When Maria was 13 years old, she attended a revival meeting and gave her life to Christ. The experience was not gentle. She described it as being overwhelmed, the presence of God falling on her so powerfully that she could not stand, could not speak, could only weep and surrender. From that night, she knew she was called to preach. There was only one problem. She was a girl, in 1857, in rural Ohio. Women did not preach. It was not done. It was not accepted. And in most churches, it was not permitted. Maria pushed the calling down. She told herself she was wrong about what she had heard. She got married. She built a life. And the calling refused to stay buried. In 1863, Maria married Philo Harris Woodworth. They settled into farm life in Ohio and began to raise a family. Over the next several years, Maria gave birth to 6 children. 5 of them died. 5 children, buried, one after another. In an era before antibiotics, before modern medicine, when childhood death was devastatingly common, Maria Woodworth stood at 5 small graves and asked God why. There are griefs that destroy people, and there are griefs that hollow people out, that carve away everything that is not essential, until what is left is something God can fill completely. The loss of her children did not destroy Maria Woodworth. It hollowed her out. And into that hollow space, the calling she had been suppressing for 15 years came roaring back. She heard the voice of God clearly. Go preach my gospel. The time for excuses was over. The time for hiding was over. She was going to preach. In 1880, Maria Woodworth held her first meeting. She was 36 years old. She had no training, no denomination behind her, no husband supporting the venture. Philo was largely indifferent to her ministry. She had her Bible and a burning conviction that God had told her to go. The first meetings were small, rural schoolhouses, farmhouse parlors, tiny country churches that were willing to let a woman speak, usually because they had no one else available. But the power of God that showed up in those small rooms was anything but small. People began to fall, not from exhaustion, not from manipulation. Under the power of God, they would be standing, listening to Maria preach, and suddenly their legs would give way and they would fall to the floor and lie there, sometimes for hours, in what could only be described as a trance. When they rose, they were changed. Weeping, repentant, healed, transformed. Word spread through rural Ohio, then through Indiana, then through Illinois. There is a woman preacher, and when she speaks, people fall into trances and rise up healed. Some came to see it because they needed healing. Some came because they were curious. Some came because they were certain it was a fraud and they intended to expose it. Almost all of them left having experienced something they could not explain. Part 4. The trances. We need to talk about the trances, because they were the most controversial aspect of Maria Woodworth-Etter's ministry, and they were also the most undeniable. People did not just fall during her meetings. They fell and stayed fallen. For hours. Sometimes for an entire day. Lying completely still. Eyes open or closed. Breathing normally. But completely unresponsive to the world around them. Medical doctors examined these individuals while they were in the trances. They pinched them. They burned them with matches. They applied smelling salts. They shouted in their ears. Nothing. The people in the trances felt nothing, heard nothing, responded to nothing. And yet their vital signs were normal. Their breathing was steady. Their hearts were beating. They were not unconscious in any medical sense the doctors could identify. They were somewhere else. When they returned, when the trance lifted, they described visions. Heaven, angels, the throne of God, Jesus himself speaking to them. They rose weeping, transformed, many of them reporting that physical conditions they had carried for years were simply gone. Maria herself entered trances during her own services. She would be preaching, arms extended, voice filling the tent, and then she would simply stop. She would stand frozen at the pulpit for an hour, 2 hours, sometimes 3, arms still raised, eyes open, fixed on something no one else in the room could see. And when she came back, she would continue the sentence she had been preaching, exactly where she had stopped. You cannot fake that. Not for years. Not in front of thousands of witnesses. Not with doctors in the audience specifically looking for fraud. By the mid-1880s, Maria Woodworth's meetings had outgrown every building that could hold them. She ordered a tent. Then a bigger tent. Then a tent that could seat 8,000 people. In 1885, she held a series of meetings in Alexandria, Indiana, that became legendary. Thousands poured in from surrounding towns and counties. People traveled by wagon, by horse, on foot, some coming from 50 miles away, because the news of what was happening was too extraordinary to ignore. The miracles were constant and varied. A woman who had been deaf for 14 years heard clearly the moment Maria prayed over her. A man with a tumor on his neck the size of a man's fist felt it dissolve during the service, not slowly, not gradually, but instantly, and stood before the congregation completely free. A young child who had not walked in 3 years walked out of the tent on her own feet. But perhaps more remarkable than the physical healings was the spiritual atmosphere. People reported feeling the presence of God the moment they approached the tent, before they were inside, before Maria had spoken a word. Hardened sinners, men who had come to mock, fell to their knees in the field outside the tent, weeping, crying out to God before they even reached the entrance. This was not the result of skillful preaching. This was the manifest presence of God, and it followed Maria Woodworth wherever she went. Not everyone was moved to worship. Some were moved to rage. The medical establishment came against her fiercely. Doctors wrote papers claiming the trances were a form of hysteria that she was deliberately inducing, that she was essentially hypnotizing vulnerable people and causing psychological damage. Newspapers published cartoons mocking her, articles calling her a fraud, a lunatic, a dangerous influence on impressionable minds. Ministers, male ministers, denounced her from their own pulpits, not because of the trances, because she was a woman preaching. And in their view, that was the more fundamental offense. In 1890, in Oakland, California, she was arrested. The charges were practicing medicine without a license and creating a public disturbance. The real reason was that she had drawn larger crowds than the city knew how to handle, and powerful people wanted her gone. The trial became a spectacle, and as we heard at the opening of this story, it became a spectacle that God used to put His power on public display. Witness after witness took the stand intending to condemn her, and ended up testifying to miracles instead. The case was dismissed, and Maria Woodworth-Etter walked out of that courtroom with her ministry not only intact, but more famous than it had been before. In 1890, while holding meetings in the San Francisco Bay Area, Maria Woodworth-Etter made a prophecy. She declared publicly that a massive earthquake and tidal wave would strike the San Francisco Bay Area. She said the destruction would be unlike anything the region had seen. She warned people to repent and prepare. The newspapers went into a frenzy. They called her a prophet of doom, a scaremonger, a woman using fear to manipulate crowds. The prophecy was widely mocked. On April 18, 1906, 16 years later, the San Francisco earthquake struck. Over 3,000 people died. The city burned for 3 days. It remains to this day one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history. Maria Woodworth-Etter had prophesied it 16 years before it happened. 16 years. The woman they called a lunatic, the woman they put on trial, had heard from God. Behind the public ministry was a private pain that few people knew about. Her husband, Philo. Philo Woodworth was not a bad man in the beginning, but the years of traveling ministry, the years of living in tents, of moving from city to city, of financial uncertainty and public opposition, wore him down. He became increasingly difficult, increasingly absent from the ministry they were supposedly building together. And eventually, Maria discovered that he had been unfaithful to her. Multiple times. In 1891, she divorced him. In an era when divorce was deeply scandalous, especially for a woman in ministry, this decision cost her. Churches withdrew their support. Some denominational leaders used the divorce as ammunition against her. Critics who had been looking for a reason to dismiss her found one. Maria Woodworth kept preaching, because that is what God had called her to do. And she had decided long ago that human opinion was not going to determine her obedience. In 1902, she married Samuel Etter, a widower who genuinely supported her ministry. He traveled with her. He helped organize her meetings. He was the partner Philo had never been. From that point, she was known as Maria Woodworth-Etter, the hyphenated name carrying both her history and her redemption. In 1904, Maria Woodworth-Etter held a series of camp meetings in Indiana that became some of the most powerful of her entire ministry. Thousands gathered. The healings were extraordinary. A woman named Mrs. Haynes came to the meetings carried on a stretcher. She had been bedridden for years with a spinal condition so severe she could not sit upright. Maria prayed over her. The woman rose from the stretcher. She walked. She walked through the entire camp meeting ground, in front of thousands of witnesses, completely healed. A man who had been blind for 11 years received his sight during one of the services. He had come to the meeting led by his wife. He walked out leading her. These were not isolated incidents. They were the consistent, documented, witnessed fruit of a ministry that spanned 4 decades. Maria Woodworth-Etter was not a flash in the pan. She was a sustained fire. Here is something that most people who know the story of Azusa Street do not know. Maria Woodworth-Etter was moving in the gifts of the Holy Spirit, healings, trances, manifestations of God's power, 20 years before Azusa Street. She was a forerunner, a woman who was demonstrating in the 1880s what the Pentecostal movement would officially birth in 1906. Speaking in tongues was recorded in her meetings as early as 1890. Words of knowledge, prophecy, healings, people falling under the power of God. All of it was happening in Maria Woodworth-Etter's tent meetings before most of the founders of the Pentecostal movement had even heard of such things. When the Azusa Street revival broke in 1906, Maria was 62 years old. She had been walking in this for over 2 decades. While others were discovering the fire, she had been carrying it for a generation. Most people slow down in their 70s. Maria Woodworth-Etter was just getting started. In 1912, at the age of 68, she held a series of meetings in Dallas, Texas, that drew thousands nightly and lasted for weeks. The power of God was as strong as it had been in her earliest meetings 3 decades before. People still fell into trances. People were still healed. The fire had not diminished. In 1918, at the age of 74, she founded Lakeview Christian Center in Indianapolis, Indiana. She pastored it. She preached in it. She prayed for the sick from its platform. A 74-year-old woman building a new church, because God had told her to. And she had learned long ago that you do not argue with God about timing. She ministered from that church until her health finally failed. In 1924, Maria Woodworth-Etter preached her final sermon. She was 80 years old. On September 16, 1924, Maria Woodworth-Etter went home to God. She was 80 years old. She had preached the gospel for 44 years. She had traveled across America in an era before cars, before planes, before the infrastructure that modern ministers take for granted, by wagon, by train, by whatever means God provided. She had been arrested, tried, mocked, divorced, denounced from pulpits across the country. And she had never stopped. She died in the city where she had planted her final church, surrounded by the people she had loved and served, at peace. The girl from Ohio who was told women could not preach, had preached for 44 years. And heaven had agreed with every word. Maria Woodworth-Etter is not a household name in the modern church. She should be. She ministered in an era when women in the pulpit were radical, when trances and healing and the gifts of the Spirit were considered either fraudulent or dangerous, when the organized church would rather have silenced the move of God than allowed a woman to carry it. And she moved in more documented miracles over a longer period of time than almost any minister of her generation. She predated the Pentecostal movement. She outlasted most of her critics. She built a church at 74 and preached from it at 80. Every woman who has ever stood at a pulpit and felt the weight of whether she was allowed to be there, Maria Woodworth-Etter went before you. She paid a price you did not have to pay. She stood in rooms that did not want her, and God showed up anyway, because He is the one who called her, and He never calls anyone He does not equip. Every believer who has ever entered the presence of God so deeply they lost awareness of the world around them. Every person who has stood frozen before the throne of God and come back changed. They know something of what Maria Woodworth-Etter carried. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel. We are telling the stories of the men and women God used to change the world, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Hit the like button if this built your faith today. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that God can use anybody, the broken, the rejected, the overlooked, the ordinary. And drop a comment below. Tell us which moment in this story struck you the most. We read every single one. The next general is coming very soon. You will not want to miss that story either. This is God's general's testimony. The God who showed up in a woman's tent in Ohio in 1880 is the same God who is with you right now. He has not changed. And if He called you, He will back you. No courtroom, no critic, no closed door can stop what God has ordained. See you in our next video. God bless you.